Welcome to the Wellness on Tap podcast with your host, Dr. Debs Eastwood.
So for today podcast, I'm sitting opposite the wonderful Hayley Perkins, who is a treasure and has got a fabulous story to tell. I'm sure she won't mind me digging deeper into certain aspects of it as we go, and find out what it is she does today and why. So I'm really looking forward to this one. Mm-hmm. I'm really welcome, Hayley.
Oh, thank you. As I was driving here, I was just thinking about all the things that I want to share. It's always a lovely opportunity to get to share my story and my mission. And I was listening to your podcast, and, you know, our mission is so aligned, you know, in that education piece, that our health and well-being isn't just about the physical. So thank you for having me here today.
You're very welcome. I'm honoured. So what is it that made you do what you do today?
So I always kind of start my story. I've had a really disordered relationship with food, weight, my body since I was very small. In fact, Mum put me on my first diet when I was 13. That's a really common thing when I'm talking to many of my clients. But actually my relationship with food started way before then. I track it back to being 6 years old. And my dad, who was my comfort, my safe space, he was the one that would read us stories at night. He went abroad to work. And so he left me. And at 6 years old, that had a massive impact on me.
You've not got the mental ability to be able to fully appreciate what's going on with you and deal with those emotions.
Absolutely. And my mum, bless her, I love her dearly. But she was 16 when she had my sister, 20 when she had me. And so her ability to cope, you know, as an adult, putting myself in her shoes now, I can totally see it. But I missed him. And by the age of 6, I'd already learnt that food and love were very closely connected. My mum really struggled to show us love conventionally. It was all done through food. You know, so many stories I could tell you, the things, sparklers in our dinner and stuff like that. So food and love were very, very closely connected. And so when Dad wasn't there, I found comfort in food. And at the time, my mum was running a sweet shop, and I used to go to the sweet shop every day after school. And I can remember stealing the sweets and filling my rucksack. And then I would hide my rucksack under the bed at home. And then when I felt like I was really missing Dad, I would sit all my teddies round in a circle and I'd eat that food. And I look at photos now of me between the age of 6 and 8, and I gained a significant amount of weight. And that kind of started a very different path for me, because when you're fat as a kid, people aren't overly kind. And although I wasn't overtly bullied, it was the little comments,
the more insidious stuff, what we would probably now as adults call all the mind games.
Absolutely. And I felt different. And as I said, Mum put me on my first diet. In fact, she put the whole family on a diet. You know, anything I ever say, if I say anything about my parents during this talk, it's, you know, they were good parents, but they get it. Our parents get it wrong sometimes, don't they? And part of my healing journey has been around honouring some of that stuff. And so I went to secondary school. All my friends had boyfriends. I didn't. So that just reinforces that not being good enough. And although I've struggled with my weight all through my life, weight was never really the problem. It stems back to that sense of never feeling good enough, that sense of rejection that I had as that little girl. So fast forward to when I was about 21, I think it was my second real boyfriend that I had. And unfortunately, again, when I track back now and I see the patterns of relationships in my life, because I was fat, I was grateful. And so I overlooked any signs of people not treating me particularly well. And this particular guy that I was with for 7 years, I went into that relationship a size 12 to 14, and I came out of that relationship 7 years later a size 24. So I gained 7 stone in that relationship.
Did that come from the same place, do you think, of feeling of rejection and wanting comfort?
Absolutely. there was physical abuse, but also he was very unfaithful. And I stayed. You know, I've spent hours trying to understand that. And I think unless you're in that situation, when you're in it, he had a way of making me feel like it was my fault. I used to think, if I'd just not said that. And even when I finally escaped that relationship, I still blame myself. So I can remember getting on the scales and I was 18 stone 9 at my heaviest. And I remember thinking, God, he wouldn't have done that to me if I wasn't that size. So I still blamed my weight. And so I went on my quest. My quest to lose that weight, because that weight was the problem. And so I spent 5 years and I did lose 8 stone. And as I pulled on my size 10 pair of jeans, that was the magic number, that if I got there, I would be okay. I'd be lovable, I'd be acceptable, all of that stuff that diet culture teaches us. You know, my weight and worth were very, very closely linked. So that was a 5-year mission for me. And I did lose 8 stone. And physically, on one level, I felt amazing. But actually, what started to happen, the reality was men started to find me attractive. And I wasn't ready for that.
No, because you hadn't fixed what was going on up here at all. And I'm guessing what you're alluding to is that really is the root cause. It was what was going on inside your head.
Absolutely.
And your heart.
Absolutely. And I physically felt the best ever, but mentally I was all over the place. And I remember a friend saying to me, you need to go and get this sorted out. So ironically, I went into therapy when I was at my slimmest. And that kind of started my healing journey, because up until that point, I still thought my weight was the problem. And so, as with many coaches and therapists, it's their own recovery, their own deeper understanding of themselves that then takes them into wanting to help others. And so I went through my own deep, it feels like I had to rip my skin off and poke around a lot to understand myself. And what I realised, that my 19 stone that I carried was an armour. You know, that extra 8 stone was like, it protected that inner me from the world, men specifically. And I can track back to where my lack of trust with men started. That was just like a revelation. You know, I'd always connected weight with being greedy or lazy or lacking willpower, which is kind of what we're force-fed with diet culture.
Indeed, isn't it? Yeah.
But actually it was much deeper rooted for me. And often we don't consider the extra weight we're carrying is a protection, because we have physical weight, but we also carry protection weight. And so the last 20 years for me have been about really understanding me and my relationship with food, weight, body image at a deeper level. And of course, you know, this is part of my story. You know, when I was having therapy, I was actually a project manager for an insurance company. And during therapy, I realised that was all about pleasing my mum and dad and society. When you're a girl, you're kind of either forced. We actually had typing lessons at school
that
only girls could take. So I typically fell into that mould of going and working in insurance. And whilst I loved the people, the job was so unaligned to me. So I didn't have children. So I took that leap of faith. I took redundancy, sold my house and retrained. And that was 20 years ago. And I started out as a counsellor, and I worked with all kinds of mental well-being, mental health, but my passion, you know, the passion, absolutely. So that's what I've really been doing for the last 20 years. Recovery is continuing. You know, I don't think we ever get to that point of feeling fixed, because with food, you have to live in the world of food. Diet culture is around us, just permeating in loads of different ways. So I do sit here saying I'm healed and recovered in lots of ways, not just around food. So I started my therapy practice 20 years ago. And then about 8 years into that, I I wanted to go deeper. I wanted to really understand the psychology of eating on a deeper level. And that's when I went into studying my psychotherapy. And I studied transactional analysis psychotherapy. And at that point, I thought I was sorted.
Explain transactional analysis. I've got an idea in my head, but I could be completely wrong as to what it is.
It's all about childhood messages, and how our childhood experiences sculpt who we become as adults. That's a very brief overview of what it is. So that's where my deeper understanding of myself came from. So again, I went off to train thinking I'm going to learn to work with people. Of course you don't. It's one of those where you have to delve even deeper. And I fully embrace that. For us to be able to hold people safely with their trauma or whatever's going on, we have to have done that work.
Totally. You can't heal somebody if you're still feeling an open wound yourself, can you? You have to be at least heading towards the scar, if not the scar fading.
Absolutely.
On your own personal wounds. That's my opinion anyway.
Absolutely. And so this is where my love of inner and outer child work came. And that's a fundamental part of the work that I now do with clients. But everything I teach, I embody, comes from personal experience, lived experience, backed up with the formal training and stuff. So that catapulted me into a very, very different area of working. And then more recently, fascinated by hypnosis more than anything, I studied advanced hypnotherapy. Wonderful. So the work that I do brings all my personal experience, 30 years of living in that world, with the more formalised side of things with my training. And it's such a delicate subject. And so many people think that weight is a physical thing. Eat less and exercise in whatever guise, because the dieting industry is getting very clever now in packaging it up in different ways. But the clients I work with are ones, they know it's not about the food. In fact, I do sometimes introduce myself as the food therapist that doesn't talk about food, because for most people who have struggled with their weight for a significant amount of time, it's not about the food.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, there is an element of that. I don't touch on that so much with my work. What we're putting into our bodies is incredibly important, the way our food is produced. So there is all of that side of things. But I very much work with the psychology, helping people to understand the why. Where does that come from? And the childhood part is such an important part of that.
For sure. So how many then do you think, both of the people that come to you and as a general populace, how many of overweight people do you think there is a large psychological element to it?
100%.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Disordered eating, we all have disordered eating because we live in a world of abundance for a start. When we look back at the cavemen, they could only eat when food was available. And so, we have such an abundance of food. We live very busy lives. We're living so unaligned to how we're meant to eat and meant to live. And of course, food is pleasure.
Absolutely.
It represents so many things: love, pleasure, reward, punishment. It was definitely a punishment for me. And so many clients will come to me and say, Hayley, I've given up smoking. I've given up, shopping, all of these things. But food is different. Not only do we need it to survive, it's the primary one. When we came into the world, the first thing we experienced was being held by mum and being fed and comforted. So it represents love and safety and comfort, all of those things at a really deep-rooted level. Also, some people who I've worked with, they didn't have that. They were put in an incubator, so they didn't have that initial comfort, and that equally plays out. For some really interesting clients over the years. I remember many years ago working with a lady who was significantly overweight in a family of very athletic. Her whole family were marathon runners, but she was about 30 stone. And we were a few sessions in, and I always like to go to the birth story. And I said to her, tell me your birth story. And she said, oh, yeah, that's really interesting. I stopped feeding inside mum about 2 weeks before I was born. And we just both looked at each other. because she could then see how that played out. Imagine she was born into the world near death because she's not had any food for a long time. Imagine how mum felt knowing that she hadn't fed her baby. And just as we were talking, I could see the connection she was making of how her mum had protected her and overfed her through her life.
Like a compensation mechanism.
Absolutely. You know, you're never going to get to that if you're only focusing on the weight as being a physical thing, eat less and exercise. So for so many, our food relationship is complicated.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one thing that you said there was something that's been buzzing in my mind while we've been talking, is very much that unlike other unhealthy patterns that we adopt in life, maybe with cigarettes, drugs, alcohol, those three are things that we choose to do in addition to survival. They don't help us survive. But food, we need it. We have to eat to be able to live. So does that make it a more difficult thing? Because it's not a case of cut it out and it's gone. You have to control it in a different way. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at?
Absolutely. And it's interesting you talk about the word control, because that's what diets do. And the way our brains work, you know, so many clients say, oh, I'm all or nothing. And that's kind of how we've been taught to operate. And when we go on to a diet, we get that book and it's got all the rules. If we follow those rules, you know, we're going to achieve what we want to achieve. So it feels safe. And that's how our brains like to feel safe. And so that word control is an interesting one. So yeah, just going back to your question around, is it harder? Absolutely, because we need food to survive. Mm-hmm. And what diets encourage us to do is to restrict. And, you know, when I look back through my life, especially when I see photos of me when I'm slimmer, my first thought will be, oh, look how slim I am in that photo. And then I start to look behind my eyes and I start to think about what was going on in my life at that time. And normally there was some kind of emotional trauma, normally linked to an unsuccessful relationship. There's definitely, if I tracked my, if I did a timeline, I was definitely at my lightest when I was emotionally walloped from a relationship ending, in a new relationship, gaining weight because I was suspicious. That first year of any relationship was always really traumatic for me because of the trust stuff I had going on. So just linking into your question about, is it harder? Absolutely.
Am I right in thinking that what you're saying to me is that if you constructed a timeline of your life, purely looking at photos of what your weight was, you could hazard a reasonably accurate guess at what was happening to you in your life emotionally at that time. So therefore, you could track what was eating, how your food intake was related to all of that as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I was a binge eater. And so I absolutely can track. And this is a really interesting one, because when I'm speaking to clients, they can absolutely go to a point of time based upon where their weight was. This is how attached we are to our weight, how significant it is and how much it drives. The key one I always get is wedding.
Oh, yes,
when they look at the photos from their wedding, oh, I wish I was as slim as when I was getting married. And when I just look at that as an example, that fear of all those eyes on you on your wedding day. And again, when you start to look at how the brain works, and this is why I'm so passionate about helping people to step away from diet culture, because it does encourage that. It encourages this whole slimmer is better. And, you know, if you want to look your best, you've got to have photos, you've got to be on video, you know. And I don't have a lot of photos of me from probably the age of about 12 or 13, because I carried so much embarrassment, so much guilt around looking at those photos. It was almost like you're looking at the evidence of like how inadequate you are.
So you didn't want to recall that. And it's understandable though, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if I was out and I saw photos, you know, in the day where you used to have to go and get them
developed,
processed, get them developed and pick them up. And I couldn't bear looking at myself. So I understand that mindset of people on their wedding day, they want to look their best. So we have this really strong attachment to being slimmer is better. And that's the bit about diet culture that I really struggle with. Like, it plays on people's insecurities. It uses like pain points. Before and after pictures I find really like icky, because it's celebrating that slimmer body. And that's not discounting the hard work people have done to get there, but it's all focused on weight. And that has been my life for 3 decades, where everything, I'd wake up in the morning, the first thought was about how I could restrict. In fact, something I did for many years was look at myself naked in the mirror to disgust myself so I didn't eat. And when I look back at that now, I just feel so much kindness and compassion for those younger selves. But that's the reality for so many people. And of course, I was the happy fat girl. No one would have known that. I'd put my makeup on every day and I'd go out into the world smiling. But inside, it was not a happy place.
No, it was a hard place to be, I would imagine.
It absolutely was. And that's the bit for me. I sit with a lot of groups of people, mainly women, and I just have this ability to give them that safe space where they start to open up. I was on holiday a couple of weeks ago, sat around the pool at the bar, and there was a couple of ladies there, and we just got talking, and they shared stories about their own struggles, and this isn't about size, it's not just people who visibly are overweight that struggle. Nearly every person I speak to has got a story, whether it's around controlling food or whether it's around using food for comfort. And so we just don't talk about it. I certainly wouldn't growing up. There's just so much shame that's attached to it. And so that's a really important thing that I bring. I bring that open, safe space for people to be able to actually be truthful with themselves and to actually speak about how they feel and what's going on behind their weight. Because very often there's a lot going on behind there, either from childhood or from how they're living their lives at the moment. So many of my clients, they're in unhappy marriages, so there's lots of things, the jobs, the kids have left home, they've lost their own identity, and food becomes a big part of that.
For sure. And this is a bit of a Pandora's box for you, I'm sure, how the media gets involved, and especially, social media when we were kids wasn't a thing. And so Absolutely. I can see the introduction of it now, how it just reinforces that message, isn't it? You've got to be slim. All them years ago, you've got to be, if you were in America, you've got to be a size 0. And it's like, hang on a minute.
There has been shifts. However, what I feel we're at now is in a really confused place, because you've still got that side of diet culture. You've also got the body positivity, where we're trying to embrace the bigger body. And then, it is complex and it's confusing, but it's like mental health generally. There's a lot more awareness, but actually the messages that are still going, supporting that, are still very much linked to slimmer is better. And, when I think about my own experience, the impact that diet culture has had on my mental health and my emotional health has been far more damaging than the weight ever was on my physical health.
Yeah, because that is an important factor, isn't it? If you are just a little bit chubby, I might be using very non-PC words here, but hell, it's my podcast. I'll say it as it is.
Absolutely.
Then maybe not so much of a physical issue. But if you are 30 stone, that does have physical ramifications for the way your body works and affects your physical health. And I know I'm separating the two out there, which is something that we absolutely can't do. But as a medical doctor, I do see that. And I am so delighted that somebody, yourself, has got the nous and the ability to be able to see and to actually physically want to do something about the underlying root cause, because root cause to me, the older I've got, the more people I speak to, the more clinical medicine that I do, I see that the root cause is the thing. And often it's just swept under the carpet.
Because people are scared. You know, when I first went into therapy, I felt a huge sense of disloyalty towards my parents, you know, of honouring some of my truth. And that's what it is a lot of the time. And this is a really important point I make to clients, that do find the courage to start to delve a little bit deeper, that this is about honouring that part of you that experienced what they experienced. It doesn't mean it was the truth. You know, my birth story was that I was a boy. So I've been told all of my life I was a boy when I was born. They named me Ian. And then when they brought me back after, because they used to take you off in those days, clean you up and then bring you back, I was a girl. And they named me Hayley after Hayley Mills. And that story was what was told. And if ever it was ever talked about, my mum would then follow it by, no, you're your dad's, you've got his ears. That was the story. Okay, so I grew up like in this fantasy in my mind thinking, are they my parents? Aren't they my parents? I never felt a huge sense that they weren't. But I used to fantasize that my real parents were rock stars, especially if they'd said no about something. But in later life, I've been able to have that conversation with mum, and mum said, oh, no, I looked down, I thought you were a boy. So this is going back to my point that what we think we experience or what we think we hear is only part of it. So it doesn't make it fact. And going back to your point about somebody who's very significantly overweight, absolutely, there is a physical impact of that. However, this is what happens a lot of the time when we only focus on the physical. I'm working with a guy at the moment that's got ARFID, so restricting his food group. So he eats 9 foods. He's been diagnosed through the NHS. He's got a dietitian and he's got a CBT therapist. All they're focused on is getting him to eat more foods, which is actually traumatizing him even more. So we're 4 sessions in. In that first session, I talked to him about his birth story, you know, and from that he was able to go and ask his mum and dad. He's always thought that he was called a fussy eater at 4 years old. Now, if you're already being called a fussy eater at 4 years old, you know that this goes way before that. So there's absolutely a need for some adjustment to how people are eating. But if we do that before we do this bit, so it's almost like the work I do is like a prelude to that other work, to do the deeper work. If not, the subconscious is resisting. You know, with me, I got to a point, I dieted so much that I'd go, right, it's Monday, I'm going to go on a diet. By 10 o'clock, I was eating biscuits. My subconscious was just like so resistant, because for most people, restriction and dieting actually represents trauma. For anyone who's been like a serial dieter for a long time, the thought of restricting in the subconscious is like, no, this is dangerous. We're not doing this anymore. And of course, the more times we go around that cycle, the harder and harder it gets, the more judging we are, the more guilt we carry, the more shame we carry because we can't stick to the diet. So there is a piece of work, irrespective of whether you're 3 stone overweight or 20 stone overweight, there's a piece of work that needs to do. And this is around settling the nervous system and helping people to understand their relationship with food and to start to break those cycles. So as what should then naturally happen is we're not so reliant on food, you know, because we're filling our needs in different ways. We're connecting with ourselves in different ways. I was massively disconnected from myself. This is a big part of the healing, is to understand that. I lived my life by my ego, the people pleaser. I spent my life trying to make everyone else happy. The being strong, I learned at a very young age. Mum couldn't handle us crying, so I'd bite my cushion, which then over time, you just stop biting the cushion, you just stop feeling. You know, everything needed to be perfect. I had, you know, the life I lived for so many years, and how I filled that void in me was with food. You know, some people become marathon runners. I didn't get that one. Food was definitely my thing. And when it wasn't food, I then had a period in my late 20s where it was alcohol and partying, raving, taking drugs, all of that stuff. But they were all really unhealthy, ego-driven ways of just trying to make me feel okay in the world.
Yeah. Satisfy that need that was there to feel full in terms of emotional fullness, mental fullness. all that kind of thing. And it's interesting you talked about the nervous system, because that controls what we do, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
And hormones very much linked into that as well. How true do you think it is that, you know, people say, oh, I blame my hormones?
Yeah, I'm sure there is an element of that, absolutely. But I think it's broader than that. I'm 53 this month, and so far so good. I have sailed through menopause. And so whilst I do think absolutely there's changes in hormones, I do also think there are other factors. People's mental and emotional health play a huge part. Same with food and weight. You know, it's not just a physical thing. You know, and if you already have, you know, menopause tends to hit at the same time that a lot of other things are happening. Children are leaving the nest. We're starting to maybe realise we're not as happy as we think we are, that actually, who am I? The whole identity piece starts to hit as well. So I think there's other factors that to be considered when it comes to hormones. You know, and when we link into weight, I would say predominantly the most people I work with are women between late 40s, mid 50s, where they don't know who they are. You know, they've spent a lifetime entrenched in diet culture, going to Slimming World, Weight Watchers, all of that stuff. And actually, they've now got more time on their hands and they don't even know where to begin. So whether it's weight or hormones or menopause, I do think there's more to it.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that, which is kind of the reason I asked, threw that one in there, because I just thinking about the audience, I'm thinking somebody's going to want to know the answer to that and your perspective on it, which is wonderful. So you've alluded to the fact that your main target clientele is ladies, mid-40s, mid-50s. So if somebody was one of your avatar clients, what would they expect from you when they met you? What would happen? Talk me through the process.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I do is I give them a space to tell their story. All of it. And I have a really good way of making people talk, because it's in the questions that you ask. You know, and that in itself, that safe space to be able to talk about stuff that often they've never talked about. And interestingly, it's very rarely about their weight.
It's about their life story more, events that have happened to them.
Absolutely, the loss they've experienced. Well, something that we talk about a lot is the ranking in, you know, where they're born in their families. The birth story is another powerful one. So that's the first thing. I know the first thing is about building that rapport and that relationship, that trust, because it's so important.
Yeah, you can't move forward without that, can you? And
this is a piece that's often overlooked. Something that I've really started to realise is this is not an 8-week program. This is not a 12-week program. This is ongoing. You know, this is about building that relationship, building that rapport. I'm a big fan of like a parallel process. As much as the work that I'm doing with the client, it's about the relationship that we're building, because quite often people don't have that. They don't have that safe space. So that's the first thing. The first thing is to create that space where people can even dare to say stuff. Because once we speak it, it's no longer the secret. You know, and I've held those dirty, dark secrets about how I felt about myself for a long time. So I've recently done a PR piece in The Sun. And I was very open, I was very honest, and there was a lot of stuff in there that my mum didn't know. We lost my dad earlier in the year. But my mum didn't know a lot of this stuff. So I had to have that call before. I didn't want the first time for her to read it in The Sun.
No.
So I called her and I had a really open and honest conversation with her, and she got really upset and blamed herself and all of that stuff. And I said, Mum, I didn't tell anybody. Nobody knew the pain behind that endless smile. So that's the first thing. It's so important to me to give people that space. And then we do some inner and outer child work, which is all about reconnection to self. And I think people get a bit scared about that. They get a bit scared about connecting to that little 6-year-old that we've all got inside of us. But it's about connecting with that little 6-year-old through our here and now self, giving her a platform to be seen and to be heard through her eyes. Because I know personal experience, when we do try to talk about how we're feeling, it was discounted, or people start talking about themselves. So we just learn to not share those parts of us. But for me, a huge part of my recovery has been connecting to that little girl and actually starting to reparent her in different ways. And the outer child is fab. A lot of people have heard of inner child, and a lot of people have heard of the outer child.
No, please elaborate. I don't know what that is either.
Okay, so your outer child is like the teenage self. So it's the ego, basically. So the ego is there to protect the inner child. And so a lot of the eating and coping mechanisms around food come from the ego. People pleasing, being strong, all of that stuff. And so for many of us, we have a very, our lives are run by the ego, run by the outer child. And so the way we calm the outer child down is through connection to the inner child.
I understand now. Then, yeah.
So I have different ways that there's a lot of drawing involved with the non-dominant hand.
Oh.
Much to clients discussed a lot of the time, on curiosity mostly. And I incorporate hypnosis as well. But it's not, again, I'm not focused on weight. I do a lot of lovely reframing stuff in hypnosis. Regression is really powerful. Just did a beautiful regression on the guy with ARFID, and we were able to go back, and he choked on porridge when he was 6 months old. He had no idea. Wow. And I can't wait to see, I only done it this week, so I can't wait to see how that changing that story that's held in his subconscious is actually going to play out for him. In fact, he messaged last night to say he tried some quavers.
The journey has begun for him.
Absolutely.
Now, hasn't it? How wonderful. That must be so beautiful for you to see.
I got goosebumps.
I know, I can see. Yeah,
I love it. I love when people let go of the idea that they're fat, lazy, greedy, all of that stuff.
And there's a reason or multiple reasons why they're behaving in the way that they do that is having the effect of them having issues with their weight.
And it's hard because quite a lot of the time it's easier to focus on the weight being the problem, because for some people, recently I worked with a lady who ended her relationship. She knew, she didn't end it because of the work we'd done. She knew when she came into the relationship, into the therapeutic space, that her relationship was contributing. She'd gained, she was 3 dress sizes bigger since she'd been in that relationship. It wasn't giving her what she wanted, but she was afraid to leave. And I can really resonate with that. I know in all my relationships, I've gained weight rather than tackle the real problem. Because when I'm heavier, I don't want to socialise. I don't want to go out. I put up with. And so it's an incredibly brave process to go through. But I'm very clear from the start that, this isn't, I'm not going to show you how to lose weight. You may lose weight as a result of the work that we do, calming the nervous system down, actually starting to meet your needs in different ways. The weight loss comes because we start to live more aligned, happier, calmer. And so we release any weight we're holding as a protection, which was definitely my thing. And that's when we're more likely to keep the weight off.
Of course, because we've dealt with what's at the root of it. Because like you said, the weight itself might be the visible thing that we see, but it's not what it's all about, is it?
Absolutely. And it's really hard to get someone past that point because, I feel better when I'm slimmer. I'm not anti-weight loss. I'm just anti-diet culture. Some of it, I've got some incredibly talented PT friends, nutrition friends who are absolutely doing it the right way. It's those small steps. It's about encouraging lifestyle change, but there's still a deeper piece that needs to be done.
For sure, because I would imagine a lot of these people have tried, like you've mentioned before, various different diets, commercial, non-commercial, and have tried exercise, and it's just not worked for them. From what you're telling me, it sounds very much like that's because none of what they've tried was bad. They just haven't addressed the real need.
Yeah, and
wanting to be met.
Diets do work in varying forms, but they're short-lived. And so, of course, what happens And the irony isn't lost on me. I used to run a weight loss program, for 10 years, which was all focused on weight loss. So the things I would say, I'd shiver at now, but you don't know what you don't know.
Totally.
Okay. Yeah. So that cycle, when you've lost weight, you genuinely think, I am never going to put this back on again. But of course, if you're heavier because you don't like your job or your relationship or your past, that doesn't change. And so, of course, what happens is, and this was me, and I've seen it in my clients, they put a bit of weight on and then they'll justify that. Well, actually, I'd lost too much weight. People were saying I was looking a bit gaunt, so I feel better at this. So their head goes back in the sand again. They're not seeing what's happening. And so what they tend to do, instead of looking at the process that isn't working for them, they blame themselves.
Yeah.
And so that guilt and shame cycle just keeps going round and round and round. And then, you see your friend who's just lost 4 stone on weight loss injections and you think, oh, I've got to do that. So we just stay stuck in that cycle of it being about weight and weight loss and hoping that the next thing that we try is going to have the magic answer. But of course, in less than 5% of cases, it does.
Gosh, is that the number?
It's an interesting industry, isn't it?
Yeah.
How many industries are out there where 95% of people, it doesn't work for them longer term, but they're still in business.
Yeah, that wouldn't work, would it, in any other business? No, that's
and
really
I was horrified to see that Weight Watchers in the US are starting a program for teenagers. Don't get me started on that one.
Should we leave that one to another time?
Yeah.
I feel like we could talk about that one on its own for ages.
Absolutely.
But can I just say a massive thank you? I've learnt an awful lot today. I think we've explored some things and you've removed some thoughts that I had, which is a good thing.
It's interesting. My other half is a retired Royal Marine and he was a PTI in the Marines. And so he very much, when we got together, came from that fat people are lazy. And he came up to see me one day and he came to the office early and he was sat in my office and I was running a group. And he was party to some of those conversations. And it was summer and there was a couple of ladies in there talking about how they hated summer because it meant they had to get their arms out and stuff like that. And he said he was sat crying in the room. That was a pivotal moment for him where he changed his perception of people who carry weight. And that's what we need to do. We need to start changing that perception, not just around like fat phobia, but also around what weight actually represents and that it's not just physical, it's emotional, mental. And we need to work on it with a treatment plan, not just another diet.
I think that's a fabulous message to leave this on. Thank you so much, Hayley.
Thank you.
We'll chat soon, I'm sure.
I'm sure.